Started. Welcome to the literature series for 52 Living Ideas and the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. Tonight is the second of 10 events on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This event is focused on the part of the novel I'm calling in the event description, the monster's story. In the 1818 edition, it's chapters 5 through 7 in volume 1 and chapters 1 through 4 in volume 2. In the 1824, which was a 2-volume edition, it's volume 1, chapters 5 through 11. And in the 1831 edition, which is only 1 volume, it's chapters 6 through 12. It goes from the murder of William to the creature learning French, from Agatha, Felix, and their father, and ending with the creature seeing his ugliness in a mirror and his plan to win the trust of his unwitting educators, Agatha, Felix, and their father. The agenda, like last time, will start with participant reflections and comments on the text. Please refrain from spoilers. Let's just talk about the first half of the novel. Then there's going to be a 30-minute breakout, and then a group Q&A. I was planning on sharing a synopsis in case anyone hadn't read it, and maybe someone hasn't read it and isn't keeping up with the reading, so I'll quickly run through a synopsis. The first half of the novel actually is slightly less than the first half of the novel. There's a little bit more in the second half on the next 2 events. Robert Walton is the captain on a ship aiming to discover the North Pole. He rescues Victor Frankenstein from a sled on an iceberg, sends a letter to his sister with the story told by his recuperating guest. Over a period of 6 years, Victor Frankenstein grows up, 6 years, he goes to the University of Ingolstadt, studying natural philosophy with particular emphasis in chemistry. In 2 years, he becomes an expert in natural philosophy and chemistry. Then, rather than attending to his family, he stays on at the university and discovers the secret of life. And in probably the first mad scientist episode in literary history, he creates a new life from spare parts from the butcher shops, cemeteries, and dissecting rooms of anatomists. Quote, "On a dreary night of November, I saw the dull eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs." That was the part of the reading for the last event. This time we pick up where Victor Frankenstein spends 2 years recovering from a nervous breakdown in horror at what he had created with his own hands. He's in Ingolstadt now with his childhood friend from Geneva, Henry Clerval, who is starting his own education at Ingolstadt. Victor learns from a letter of the murder of his brother and returns home. We have the conviction and execution of Justine Moritz for William's murder, the dramatic reunion of Victor with his creature on the glacier Montanvert in the Swiss Alps. And the monster speaks and tells the story of his 2-year life, or I should say starts telling the story Next event, we will finish that story. So we're going to start with participant reflections, observations, or interpretations. If anyone wants to, if anyone has any reflections, observations, or interpretations about the first half of the novel through this point where the creature sees his reflection in the mirror and thinks about winning over his unwitting educators, you can put an exclamation point in chat. I've subtitled the series The Art of Interpretation, and to try to inspire the idea of interpretation, I'll repeat the definition I gave last time that I'm using. I found this in the book, The Design Way. An interpretation can be seen as a picking and choosing of what is to be considered and in what way. So for my interpretation that I'll share with you to get the ball rolling, I take first that Victor and his fiancée and first cousin, Elizabeth Lavenza, are convinced that Justine Moritz is innocent of the murder. There's the circumstantial evidence of the picture of Victor's deceased mother, Carolyn Beaufort, which in Elizabeth's testimony at Justine's trial, she called the bauble on which the chief proof rests. If she earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her. So much do I esteem and value her. The justices were evidently unmoved by that testimony. Justine is executed for the murder anyway. Even though in the modern theory of detective fiction and I believe law, the defendant is supposed to be proven to be at the scene, and that's not quite shown, although it's possible from the text. And then the mental state of the perpetrator intending harm should be shown, but detective fiction is a very new genre in 1818, and maybe our legal system has improved, although I'm not so sure. I looked it up, and every year 2 to 6 Americans on death row are cleared of their crimes due to miscarriages of justice. So my final point in the interpretation is that maybe there are many monsters in this novel. The creature is an obvious monster. Last month, several participants pointed out that Victor Frankenstein could be the monster. And I'm wondering if the execution of Justine Moritz is a monstrosity in a monstrous criminal justice system that more than 200 years later continues to be monstrous in its facility to accuse and sometimes execute innocents. So maybe that's, considering those ideas in that way, maybe this monster story has more to say than just the story of the science of the creation of the creature. It's your turn now. Put an exclamation in chat if you have an observation, an interpretation, a reflection. I'd like to hear from everyone who's read. Go ahead, Allison.
I think Madeline had her hand up before me.
Oh, I missed that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Allison. Yeah, I'm on board with Victor Frankenstein as the monster. Um, I thought that Justine's trial, I think by the standards of the time, it was probably regarded as being very fair. Um, the Black Ballads, it's where we get the phrase blackballed from. It's a type of secret vote where everyone is given a white and a black ballot, or usually used to be a ball like a marble or something, and you put them in a box so no one knows who the dissenting vote is. So it was a trial by jury with a secret ballot, basically. I was particularly galled by Victor's self-pity throughout the whole thing. Oh, Justine thought she was suffering. Oh, I suffered even more. Oh, Elizabeth was suffering. Oh, my suffering was even worse. I mean, he's just well, it's being recorded for YouTube, so I won't say it, but he's basically very self-pitying throughout the whole thing. And the sorrows of poor Justine. I mean, she's basically orphaned. She goes back to the family she's been with, and then something goes horribly wrong. And then in the world of what I assume they were Catholic, because she was, it turned out the reason she confessed was ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued to endure it. In an evil hour, I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable. So I think it speaks to her character that she says, I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. And then it's after that that the passages of poor Victor's suffering being worse kind of really start to come into play.
Great. Thank you, Madeline. Allison, and then Doug.
Yeah, I was thinking that I feel like it's really a deceptively simple story, about the creation of a monster, but it really deals with these themes that are so much deeper. And the biggest one that I see is the role of the outsider, and how frequently, if somebody is an outsider, if they're different from the main group in any way, they're not trusted, they're maligned. People assume all the bad things that someone could do, it must be the outsider. And it's really, it's the monster, but also Justine in this situation, that they always assume that's, the worst of that person. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is, what's kind of interesting is when Frankenstein assumes it's the monster, but in a way, he's almost taking the guilt on himself because he's the one who created the monster. So when he immediately, he's not trusting that what he made, I mean, just because he was standing nearby doesn't mean anything, Anytime someone is murdered, there's always plenty of people around. Well, not always, but there can be. But really his immediate go-to that it was the monster was because he wasn't trusting that what he created was, a good person. So it's kind of not trusting himself in that regard. And then the other thing that I really see is this idea of these really beautiful descriptions of nature. And I thought it's kind of interesting because when he creates a human being, that's going against nature in a way. And so it's like contrasting these two things. And I feel like that's something that we still see today, where we're constantly battling between these things that we're able to create versus what's actually just in nature itself. And there's always this battle between them. Which one should we do? And you see it whether we're talking about a vaccine or you're talking about a yard, sometimes people, they want everything, they want to tame nature in the yard and they want grass, but only this high. And, and then other people just want nature to just be the way it is. And So but I feel like, especially when this is written at that time, it's when they're starting to move into this whole scientific era. So there's naturally a lot of mixed feelings about what's going to come with that science. And we still have a lot of those mixed feelings today. So those are just my thoughts about things.
Yeah, I think that nature and Victor's creation is a powerful issue. And I really valued Madeline's reminding us that Justine confessed falsely. You know, the idea of the false confession, it's you know, I didn't know they knew about that back then. Confessions may be false. Doug, your thoughts? Doug, are you muted?
I wanted to pick up on the last point in terms of ever since the Inquisition, I think we've known false confessions are a very real possibility. They tortured them out of people and then they killed them to save their soul. And I think she's aware of that and what she's doing here. The two things that struck me were exactly what Allison and Madeline hit on, is the trial and Dr. Frankenstein. There's a really weird implication that he could confess what he's done, but he's afraid no one would believe him, and he's afraid of the shame that he created this. So in one sense, his suffering is worse than hers until she lies, and then she starts suffering. But he doesn't tell the truth that he knows, and and it is interesting that he leaps to the monster did it, which is true. The creature did do it. Try not to use creature, because I think if you use creature and creator, then the book starts to also become a metaphor on God and the world he's created here, where nature is a terrible thing. You live by the sweat of your brow, but it also brings gifts, that the poor can bring a fresh flower, the brother can bring a fresh flower to his sister, and that everybody's born with a kind of openness to joy, but they're often then trained out of it. Or our brutal God beats it out of you, and terrifies you, or representatives of God terrify you. So, I mean, there is a whole interesting flip where the novel suddenly seems, this is not so much about the scientist and his creature, but about God and his creatures. And nature has this beauty that is like when the creature sees spring going on, and he sees that it creates more food and it creates more work and it creates more openness among the people he's watching, who seem very open but also very worried. And then you realize they're worried because they're living through winter, and then the spring arrives and there's plenty and everybody opens up. But it reminds me of Bucky's obsession on expansion, and Tai Chi does that too. What expands your reality and what constricts your reality, what contracts you and what opens you. And I found that sort of force of an opening action and a closing action, things that dancers work with all the time, that kind of, that sort of fear, and even certain 19th century acting principles, or what are you drawn to? What are you repelled by? And that's sort of so the Delsart acting things of trying to analyze repulsion and attraction and neutrality. And neutrality is just trying to figure something out. There's a lot of, like in Shakespeare, there's a lot of neutrality in this. With monsters, just trying to figure it out. He knows there's something like language. He knows there's something like reading, and he knows he has to try to figure these out. So he in a way, even though he's an artificial creation, he is what Bucky would call a natural born genius, who is then, becomes an evil genius by the training he gets from humanity and the world around him and the fear that people bring to him. And that leads to a ferocious anger that is not really natural to him. So that, to me, the psychology of this is fascinating. I like that insight into the nature of the trial by jury and the secret ballad and the black ball, and that's really fascinating. But the most startling thing is that Dr. Frankenstein could save Justine or make a stab at it by confessing to what he's done, and he refuses to do it. And I find he is monstrous in that. He knows the truth and he doesn't make it active in the world or even try to make it active in the world. He just hides and watches. And it is a kind of false suffering that he brings on by not making the truth active. So that's my first hit.
Yeah, that's fascinating that Victor cannot bring himself to tell the truth. And his reasons are perfectly respectable, but shouldn't he try anyway? Can you really bear this burden without sharing it with at least a friend? I mean, Clerval, Elizabeth, somebody would listen to him, no? But he can't, And I thought I had something else, but it looks like it's Bob's turn. Bob, your thoughts?
Hi. I like both the people, DW and Madeline, and what they had stated. I also felt that the nature of the term creator and creature does tie into, supposedly, not, I don't believe this, but supposedly into God and his creation, his central creation, which would appear to be humans. And God forgave, sort of by virtue of how God has existed. He has, how can I put it? He has forgiven himself much more easily than Frankenstein forgives himself. God just lets whatever's bad happen, and my mind seems to just move on. He may punish some on one day, he may praise others on another day, but sort of with him, life goes on. With Victor, it stopped. I mean, he created one thing, and I don't know. I just felt that he is way too hard on himself. I'm forgetting the fact that why is he? What is he so upset about? It seems almost, or at the beginning at least, that he's upset simply by the reprehensible appearance, and which, I mean, beauty only goes skin deep does not seem to make him feel any better about his own creation. So that's all for starters.
Yeah, that makes me think that maybe the novel is about the failure to overcome our prejudices of ugliness in some sense. You know, that would be one way to go with it. Madeline, you have another thought.
Yes, at the beginning of the section that we read for this time, he arrives at Geneva, but the gates of the town are shut. So he rents a boat and he goes out on the lake, and there's a lightning storm. And I thought of what Doug said last time about the blasted tree and the importance and really recurrence of lightning in all of this. And it's there. So he gets out of the boat, presumably, and then he says, This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge. As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. So now we see that it is his creature. And then he says, could he be the murderer of my brother? He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. And I love that. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I mean, we see it all the time going on in the media today. We see it going on in our own minds. It's like, oh, I thought of this, it must be true. And so I thought in this entire section that we read for this week, that there was a lot of lightning. There were a lot of storms and lightning. I mean, I guess when we're out of the Justine section, we'll get to more of that. But it was really quite interesting. And I saw a connection between this electricity in the sky, the lightning, and Robert Walton's interest in magnetism. I don't know if at the time they thought of it as electromagnetism or if they thought of it as two separate forces. But at least to, the minds in our current era, it does kind of bind the two together, kind of in a scientifically thematic way.
Thank you. What you said about Victor, jumping to conclusions that the monster, the creature, murdered his brother. The justices in Justine's trial jumped to the conclusion based on more evidence than Victor had that Justine committed the murder. I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition, that we have a lot of jumping to conclusions, and which jumping of conclusions do we believe and is compelling? It's a vexing question. Anyone else put in exclamation mark in chat if you have something to say about the text. To try to stimulate one more comment, or I hope, I'm going to quickly, for each event, I plan to put in some themes that are little snippets, sometimes quotes, sometimes concepts from the reading that I thought might inspire interpretations. And one of the lines in the text that I thought was great is, when falsehood can look so like the truth. That could inspire some thoughts. One of the things I really got inspired reading this is that this isn't a Gothic horror story or one of the first science fiction tales. Maybe it's a travelogue, the travelogue of the country getaway to the valley of Chamonix. Chamonix, I don't know how to pronounce French, but there I go. I do my best. And there's a line, the creature says, life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me. And another thing that really struck me in this section is comparing the education of Walton in the early letters. He talks about how he educated himself. The education of Victor, both at home and at the University of Ingolstadt. The education of Clerval, his before Ingolstadt, and then when he gets to Ingolstadt, And the education of the creature, which Doug mentioned, is a wonderful. All of these ideas and more, I've only sampled some of my themes, might inspire reflection, interpretation, different ways of fitting the pieces. Anyone want to say more or speak for the first time? I'm not seeing any.
I just did want to say that it struck me in that section when they go to that area of France and the mountains, that the geography of the piece really exploded for me, that it is a kind of travelogue. It's a very interesting thing to maybe explore as we go further with it.
It's a travelogue from the beginning with Walton going to Archangel and Petersburg and the North Pole. And, well, he doesn't get there, but hasn't gotten there as of what we've read so far, at least. And yeah, those of us who have read Beyond will see the travelogue theme come back again. Any other final thoughts, or is it time for breakout?
Well, the idea that different geographies can have different spirits and different nature spirits seems to be hidden in this piece. You know, that the land and the water have spirits, that the I don't know where to go with that, but it's worth paying attention to, that territory and the moisture of territories. I remember living really in the desert at an artist's retreat where it was founded by a concert piano player. And she had gardens where people could work on the garden, but the retreat was basically you let nature do what it does. If a branch falls, you watch it rot over decades. You don't clean it up. You leave it there. But then she had a garden that everybody could mess with the garden. And then I took a walk out from the retreat and it was very hot, very dry. And then I walked around a corner into a ravine that was very much like an oasis where there was water and there was moisture, and the quality of the air changed radically. I mean, the quality of the mood changed radically because you were entering something more like what the groves represented for the Greeks and what the oasis represented for people in the Bible traveling through these fierce wilderness. But then they're in an area with water, and the hospitality of that space was so palpable to me. It made me realize there's a whole thread of that in literature, you know, the place where, and what Bucky called it, the Naga spirits, the snake spirits that lived in the rivers of India and along the coastlines. They saw the curving coastlines as snake spirits, Bucky did, and he saw Naga spirits, and he saw the rivers as. And then you realize civilization gathers around rivers and shores and water, basically, you know. So she seems to really have a feel for that, the quality that each landscape has, you know.
Thank you. Madeline, you have something to add?
Yes, I thought travelogue was a very apt term. I believe it was a very popular genre at the time. I had spent some time looking around. Apparently, the Shackleton expedition came about a century after this, but there was plenty of written material available on people's explorations of different regions. And the Chamonix area is very well known. I've never been there. I did notice in this section that, like when he was at Ingolstadt, the seasons passed and he wasn't feeling anything about them, and he was sort of oblivious to it all. And when he was depressed, it didn't matter that the summer was beautiful. And then as soon as he started traveling home, suddenly his emotions were aligned with the beauties of the world. And it even happened in the Chamonix region, where first he's up in this very beautiful area and he's feeling happy. And then he gets into this area with beautiful, dark trees and mysterious fogs and mists, very like a Caspar David Friedrich painting. And as soon as he gets into the gloomy area like that, his spirits plunge again, and then that's when his creature appears.
Okay. We're supposed to do a breakout, but with 5 participants, I'm not sure that makes sense. Allison, do you think, I'm wondering if I pause the recording, will I be able to restart it? I mean, I assume I would.
You should be able to.
And so let me pause the recording and do a breakout where people won't have to be on. Okay, and then we'll put the recording back on, let's hope, for a Q&A at the end.
This meeting is being recorded.
So we're back from our breakout. And we
Okay.
have, 40 minutes or so or more for Q&A. Yeah.
See, I have to go again. Only this time I don't think I'm going to come back.
Okay.
So take care, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Bye,
Bye.
Bob.
Bye.
Bye.
So for Q&A, what I'd like to do is gather questions. One question could be the one Bob just raised. How do you process Victor's that Bob raised in the breakout? How would you process the rejection, the intensity of Victor's work on solving the principle of life, creating a creature, and then utterly rejecting it, so that when he sees that creature 2 years later, he starts off, basically wanting to kill it in mortal combat. Another question I might put for you is Victor the true murderer? Which is a question he asks of himself. Who else would like to put a question on the table? Anyone have a question you'd like to raise for us to process?
Sorry, CJ, I was just spacing out for a second. Did you mention beauty and appearances?
And what would be the question?
I don't know, the role of beauty and appearances in the novel.
Yeah, well, I think that's I don't know how to formulate it, but I think that's a good instinct.
Thank you, Madeline.
I think it centers around essentially the idea of, oh, it's not a cute baby. Do we kill it, or throw it in the river, or it's there is a sort of reaction he has that, oh, it's not beautiful. Which is a very limited concept of beauty, also, but that's something else.
Any other questions we can gather?
Yeah, I had one. Why do we demonize people who are different? whether they're different in a good way or anything that's different, we assume all these negative qualities. Why do we do that?
Can I broaden that to what's the role of prejudice in the novel?
Sure.
I think that's
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
I think that's a step away from the sort of primary, the other, the xenophobic reaction as opposed to the inclusive reaction, the kind of, yeah, it is prejudice, but it's a more instinctual reaction to what's foreign or different or.
Right, because I think the real issue is, when people have a prejudice, it's usually against something that's different. So why? Is it that we just feel more comfortable with things that we understand? But it's almost like we have a fear of anything that's different. And it's that fear. Maybe it's like maybe it actually goes back to self-preservation, because if things that we know are safe, we're safe for things we know. And if something comes in that's different, it could be a threat. So we automatically feel afraid of it. Maybe that's what it stems from.
I think the role of shame in this novel may also be valuable to explore and somewhat connected to this.
Okay, prejudice and shame. I like that. Anyone else with a question that either our conversation or your reading raised in your mind that you'd like to hear us grapple with?
It might come later, but I think I would like to see us grapple with what's the implication of the modern Prometheus? What is Mary Shelley doing with that? But I'm not sure this is the time to discuss that. Maybe later.
My feeling was that question would be better on our second round through, so that we had the whole of the first reading.
Well, that's what I say. I'm in no rush to discuss.
Yeah. But if we have time, we'll go for it today. Mike, are you back? Do you have a question? Your hand's still up, so if you're back, could you unmute and either clear the hand raised or ask a question if you have one for us? One question I'd like to know what people think is, there's a quote in here: "Why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute?" And I'd like to know what Mary Shelley was getting at there.
What was the context of that?
I have to find it. Let's gather some more questions and I'll try to find context. Okay, I'm not seeing any more exclams, no more hands raised, so no more questions. Well, we started discussing already, so maybe it's close enough to our minds. What's the role of either prejudice or shame in the novel? Does anyone want to try to address Allison? And Allison's question was was in one sense broader in life. But we can restrict ourselves to the novel or go out of the novel. And the role of prejudice or shame. I'm not sure how I would even get my head around that question. Does anyone have any thoughts on how to address it? How would you address addressing it?
I have one thought about approaching that, which it's a question actually I've been trying to formulate. And like all the modern psychologists, particularly Jung and Freud, both saw that the artists discovered things about psychology sometimes centuries before the psychologists did. And so I think the shame, I worked a lot on Jekyll and Hyde at one point, and there's a point where Hyde is a creature that emerges out of Jekyll's shame for something that's never described what he does. And Nabokov tries to define it, and this came up, I think I mentioned this briefly when Madeline brought up the homoerotic elements in this novel, and that there is I think after the Enlightenment, the idea that we still do shameful things, that we do things that we're embarrassed by, or that people don't act rationally, that they don't do the right thing, the good thing, the beautiful thing. And it's often driven by a different concept of beauty or a different sort of, but it's an area that is very interesting, that at this particular time when philosophers had created the age of enlightenment, that there is this rage and darkness and primordial sort of passions that start to emerge that 100 years later the psychologists try to explain as something that comes from the unconscious or something comes from the subconscious or something. They even argued about what terms to use. But these things that emerge that people have to hide and often give that tremendous power. Jekyll hides what he is. Jekyll hides what he is, so Hyde gathers around this hidden energy and emerges into an explosion of violence and rage, which is a classic kind of concept of Jung's idea of the shadow, but Stevenson discovered it 50 years before, that there's. So I think foreigners often carry that side, of what is the rejected element of ourselves. Though we project it onto the foreigner. I think the Greeks in Thebes, Oedipus' story itself is not so much a story about the Oedipal complex as it is a story about Thebes is xenophobic and afraid of the stranger, whereas Athens was a city that included the stranger into its culture. And it included people from other worlds. And there's a very distinct struggle in the Oedipus trilogy between the xenophobia of Thebes. Oh, that's evil. We must, drive him out. And Athens that actually accepts Oedipus, and they bury Oedipus in a grove, a sacred grove in Athens, or in a crevice in a hill. He disappears into a crevice in a hill. But the rejected element, the shameful element, often becomes the cornerstone of the temple. And I think the Romantics were really trying to wrestle with that. I don't know if that helps, but I think that's what a lot of the Gothic literature is about. These shameful impulses that enlightened people should not do, but they do it. They do the wrong thing. Why do they do that?
Allison, what would you add?
So just 3 weeks ago, I was on a bus from Athens to Delphi, and it drove right past Thebes.
Wow.
And so, but what's interesting about it is I think the thing is that Thebes is really like in the middle of nowhere, and it's actually like in a plain, and it's very, very exposed. So if anyone comes in and attacks, there's nowhere really for you to go. You're just kind of trapped there. But Athens, on the other hand, is a port city, and port cities generally, most port cities tend to have lots of newcomers from other places, and they tend to be more open-minded because they're used to being around other people. So I just, it's kind of interesting. I took a picture of it. It's very strange. Like, there it is.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
There also might be just general issue of, self and other manifesting at community level. I assume it's very multidimensional. Does anyone else want to add something about the role of prejudice or shame in the novel or in life? Okay. How about a simple question? Is Victor the true murderer? Victor says, I'm the true murderer. Is he right? Or is it just dramatic effect? Well, what's going on with...
Madeline has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Madeline.
Yes, well, that question, it reminds me of the novel The Quiet American by Graham Greene. In it, people call it's a first-person narration. There is a murder in it. People say the first-person narrator is unreliable. Actually, nothing he says is a lie. It's just you put it all together at the end. It's really good. And what he does ultimately is that he doesn't kill someone. So at the beginning of the novel, he's saying, I told the police I didn't kill him, and I reminded myself it is true. I didn't kill him. What he did do, however, was make a deal with a group of people who wanted to kill the guy, that he would make an appointment with him, so he knew he'd be crossing this kind of deserted bridge at a certain time, and they could get him then. So he set up a murder, but he didn't commission it, pay for it, or commit the act himself. So it reminded me of that sort of hidden agency, because in Frankenstein's basic sort of lie at this point, which is that he just lets the whole thing go on with Justine and lets her die. He's wondering if in the future he is going to be responsible for what the monster, oh my God, I can't believe I said monster, for what the creature has done. And we do see a foreshadowing at some point of Elizabeth. There's something about her, but there was an earlier scene where he also saw her, he saw her dead face or something, or her rotting corpse in his delirium. And then there's a part in here where the two are juxtaposed, just something about Elizabeth and the murder and everything. And you start to think, oh, maybe she'll be next. We don't know.
Any other thoughts on Victor as the true murderer? Whether to believe what he says or...
Yeah, it feels an appropriate self-judgment to me. And I think it's what a lot of the people behind the Manhattan Project felt. There were some who certainly said, we're not responsible for the way this is used. We're the creators. But many of those scientists were profoundly depressed for the rest of their lives and felt deeply responsible for the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it feels like, yeah, he's done something, he's created something, and then it could have been dangerous even if he assumed responsibility, but he didn't assume any responsibility. And so it seems. And then there is something later with Elizabeth where it's like he almost causes that death too. You know, there's, I mean, I'm sorry, we're getting into spoilers, but it seems like there's something with Elizabeth that's, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
Okay, so I don't, well, I still see Mike's hand up, but he hasn't responded. Mike, if you're there, unmute and say hi. I found this passage where why does man boast of sensibilities? They're on their excursion to the Valley of Chamonix, and where should I start? How about the pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are somber and add an air of severity to the scene. I looked on the valley beneath. Vast mists were rising from the rivers which ran through it, and curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountains, whose summits were hidden in the uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky and added to the melancholy impression I received from the objects around me. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free, but now we are moved by every wind that blows and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us. And then she gives half of the poem by her husband, Mutability. Why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? What's the role of this in the novel?
Well, for one thing, the brute in this novel, the creature, certainly has sensibilities like everyone else, like all the other humans. You know, he's a biological human being, and he seems to have all of the built-in abilities that we do, not just the way that, say, a smart dog might find the shepherd's hut, or you know, maybe one of the other great apes might figure out how to keep a fire going for a little while if he found one. But that it's a language acquisition, both spoken and written. That's such a characteristic of human beings. So I'd say we have a brute. We have a brute in the novel, at least as far as Frankenstein is concerned. But that brute is very much like us.
Anyone else want to tackle that passage? Okay. We have Bob's question. How to process Victor's rejection of his creation. How do you think about that?
Say the question again.
How would you process or interpret or think about Victor's rejection of his creation? You know, that scene happened in the reading for last time. But now that we know so much more and Victor has met the creature again, do we have any more insights into why Victor, well, I guess we know how Victor rejects his creation. So the more interesting question might be, either why or what role does it play in the novel?
Well, I read it almost in theatrical terms. I mean, it's an immediate aversion and rejection. It's just immediate, kind of almost. I don't think it's thought out. I don't think it's rational. It's just a gut. I created something. It's ugly. It's unbearable. And he just runs. He doesn't even linger to see what it does, or it seems distinctly unscientific even to say, okay, I'm not going to study what I've created. I'm going to just run away from it. I mean, it seems like it's a complete, total physical aversion to what he's created.
Which is a fear of all designers. I might create something evil.
That's interesting, yeah. I felt that in running a theater for 20 years. And when people turned from a show because it didn't work, they really lost what they could learn from that failure. And so they just kept fantasizing they're doing great work, but they're not really studying what works, what doesn't work. They're not willing to look. Everybody turns from it like somebody, it didn't make money. So it could even be a good show, but it didn't make money. And so they turn from it. And then the adrenaline from a show that sells tickets, even though it's maybe not a great show, but it's popular, and that's fine. But people just, it's like cocaine going through the veins of a theater. Of money is coming through the theater. But then a show that's really good, that's not selling tickets, people just don't want to even sort of deal with it. They just sort of close, let it close and move on to the next one. But he hates it so much he really even gives up the practice of science and design.
And
doesn't he? I mean, isn't that?
Yeah, all he wants to do now is go into the mountains and be overawed by Mount Blanc and the glacier and
early retirement.
Allison, your thoughts?
I think of it, it's like a parent with a child. And I feel like, she wrote this so that Frankenstein is supposed to be like her lover, and that the creature is her child. But I think you could also take it to any parent, because, there are parents, usually it's a father, but sometimes a mother too, who just instantly abandon their child upon birth, just gone. And then you have others who, some, people go different ways, where their child is all perfection in their mind, that no matter what they do, they could, they could become a serial killer, but my child's perfect, and they're not. And then you have others who do the opposite, where they seem to spend their entire lives, they don't physically reject their child, but they battle their child forever. And that they're constantly annoyed with their child for not being them. And, so it's interesting to see the different ways that people handle parenthood. And, I think the best ones kind of sit back and go, well, let's see what I've created. Let me see. Right. But some of them have this idea before they, before they even have children, they decide what their children are going to be like. My child will do this, my child will do that. And then they're appalled that their child did not become that. I've had this theory for a while. I would, Doug, you could do it. That there should be a play or a movie or something about art school parents, so that parents are taking their children to tour various art schools, and then something happens so that the parents are trapped somewhere, like a snowstorm, and then the dynamics between the parents and the children, and then, you know, some child confesses that he's not actually going to go to art, you know, and the parents are real artsy, and the child's like, I'm not actually going anyway, I've already signed up for the Marines, and you know.
Oh, yeah.
But the thing is, you have this, you have like the artsy parents that want the artsy children, you have, you know, the lawyer parents that want the lawyer children, and so sometimes there's the rejection is this immediate, you know, drop the baby off at the firehouse, and then sometimes the rejection just sort of insinuates over the next 40 years, but it's a rejection never the same, and you know, um I don't know. I think that maybe anybody who ever decides to become a parent should read the Tao Te Ching first.
Read the what?
The Tao Te Ching first. So they realize, like, it's a river, let it flow. It's going to be what it's going to be. And they're not going to be,
Oh, yeah.
get over it. And, you know, I don't know.
Madeline,
Yeah, Madeline, yeah.
Madeline, go ahead.
Yeah, I liked what Doug said about the theater, the performances, and how people would turn on something or be enthusiastic about something. And it reminded me of what you said in the breakout room, CJ, about, oh no, I made the wrong thing. There is something to that when you're writing something or painting something. Sometimes you have to scrap the early drafts. And there are certainly stories in other cultures, besides the one that Mary Shelley was in, about the gods creating people more than once. And the first draft was, you know, they got rid of, and the second draft they also got rid of, and the third one was pretty good, so that's the one they kept. So on the other hand, he did contemplate making a humbler organism. And instead, he decided to not only make a human being, but a sort of superhuman one. Since there's no way that, I'm not sure what the world record holder for height is, but I'm not sure I've ever seen anyone who's more than 7 feet tall. And this man was 8 feet tall. The creature was 8 feet tall. So it was definitely a big outsized creation, cannibalized from the past, and kind of the first draft of something, really. You know, like the first pass at a painting, or the first draft of a work of fiction, or maybe an idea for a computer program where a lot of stuff eventually gets taken out. So I think that and that instant rejection, it's strange that he never wants to work with his creature, never wants to say, like, what could I do to help, or or even just what could I do to improve this project? You know, can I do some more surgery, get some fat under the skin? Could I give him lipstick for his lips so they don't look black? I mean, he just outright rejects him.
Botox.
Your thinking makes me, you know, consider, is it ever morally tenable to create a new life knowing that your prototype is going to be flawed in many ways? Is creating a life something that ought not be undertaken unless you can do it perfect? But you can't do it perfect, so, you know, is that an interpretation?
Well, this is where it's a metaphor for God, I think. And there's a guy who teaches a course on negotiation. He's Jewish. He teaches it at Harvard, but he teaches it in one of the learning companies. And he actually starts it by talking about one of the Jewish prophets negotiating with God, because he realizes mankind is so rotten and terrible, he's got to destroy all of them in this particular city. And the prophet goes, well, what if I find 100 good people? Will you save the city? And he goes, fine, good, fine. I couldn't find 100. What if I find 10? Will you say, yeah, okay, find 10. So he negotiates with God to sort of accept the flaws, and he negotiates the edge of the probability. And then he finally is one good man. And oh, yeah, I think God finally agrees. But in the end, I think the one good man is exiled from the city and the city is destroyed. But it's like that negotiation, in the Bible, the idea that it's a flawed creation is pretty much rooted in the beginnings of the story.
But I think we could also interpret it as homo haber, man the tool maker.
Right.
And is man as a tool maker, ought man as a tool maker make things like life that we're certain, because all creations are flawed, is going to be flawed, and may be so flawed that you can't stand it, you're appalled by it. Is that a reason not to try to, that we ought not to make those kinds of designs, that we can't handle them being flawed? Or maybe the issue would be, maybe we can create life, but we just have to come to love the monstrosities we will produce. Maybe it's an exercise in diversity and what's the word for the opposite of prejudice? Acceptance of the other, however flawed we end up making them.
Well, I think that's why Bucky's commitment to the trial and error process is a little bit illuminating here. That, yeah, it is flawed. Nothing is perfect. You approach perfection, or maybe you approach it. Maybe you don't come nowhere near the ballpark of perfection, but but there is a thing in theater, like the idea of ready, aim, fire, that everybody gets so want to be ready and they want to know it's going to work, and they never do it. Whereas there's another thing, just fire, ready, aim, fire and then re-aim, rather than, and a lot of artistic process is like firing away and then re-aiming, recalculating, so
maybe.
But that is a really good question that has bigger issues than I'm even addressing. I mean, it sort of disarms me, the question.
So another way to interpret it would be that the novel is criticizing Frankenstein for, the novel talks about the iterative approach. I tried this and it didn't work. I tried that and it didn't work. He's done this iterative effect. But then when he gets to the result, he stops the iteration because he expected it to work perfectly the first time. Maybe one interpretation would be that the novel is a critique of the expectation that your design will be good enough the first time. Madeline, you have something to add. And Allison.
Well, oh yeah, okay. What we were talking about, it kind of goes to the topic of, the sort of outcast other. And I was thinking that when we were first discussing it, about the sort of basic safety instincts, just of us as biological beings and as social animals, which is look for the outsider, look for the stranger. Are they safe? Are they safe? But really, historically in other cultures, there are many cultures that have been very accepting of very, very strange people. All sorts of odd people who just kind of live on the edges. No one's giving them a hard time about it. Some of them are regarded as sacred, some are regarded as eccentric, but they're just accepted. And I think that in comparison with, and it may be that during tough times, a culture really, really needs those people who are diverse thinkers and actors and behaviors. The people who are getting the direct messages from a little niche god that lives in the river or something. Or, you know, they might have lots of weird ideas about counting and number systems, and then some other culture comes in and they're the one who helps combine the two number systems or something. I mean, there are all sorts of cultures that tolerate differences. And it seems, you know, certainly in the Europe of Mary Shelley's time, differences were not highly tolerated. You know, she and her family already were so very, very different from the expectations of the time. The way she had been raised, what her parents were like, everything like that. She was already really an outsider in many ways.
Thank you, Allison.
I had kind of similar thoughts because I feel like that, you know, the time in which she wrote this was, you know, if you think about, you know, the United States, it was, you know, they're really starting to try to tame the West. And that was the word they used, tame the West. And everything, I mean, I feel like, you know, in Europe as well, even within European society, everything is like taming nature. And so I think you have this kind of idea of that, on one hand, you're creating this new person, but at the same time, you know, it toys with this idea of taming it, because you created this person, but you can't really control what they're going to do. So not only is there this idea of anti-diversity, you know, like we don't want something that's different, but it's also that we can't tame what's different. So the whole thing of control is really big in this, I think. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she said it in Switzerland, because when you think about Switzerland, you know, there's no ports, there's no openness to society. Every village is sort of hemmed in by these mountains, which kind of creates a more insular world in some ways. And especially, you know, when you compare that with London or Paris or, you know, Rome, or, you know, all of these cities that are, I mean, Paris is not on a port, but it's not that far away from the ocean, but you know what I mean? But especially when you're hemmed in by the mountains, you tend to sort of like, you're just living in the little world of who's there. And so anybody that comes in that's different is going to be more noticeable. Whereas if you're in a city that has access to so many other people, you have to be more accepting of them. And I think people tend to be less tolerant of diversity when they're not around it. And people that, I mean, if you look at even like which American cities tend to be more accepting of diversity are the cities that are more diverse. When people are in more, you know, homogenous towns, that's when they tend to look at somebody that's different with more suspicion, because they don't have any experience with it. So it's more frightening to them. But it's really interesting how this was written so long ago, and then these themes are all still with us. They're all things that we're wrestling with still today, which is why we're still reading it, you know. And it's not just because it's a Halloween story, it's much deeper than that.
It's an intricate touch briefly on 1,000 issues, which the attentive reader can go off in tangents and speculate and interpret, and yeah, I just get lost in this novel. Just, you know, every paragraph is so evocative of so much that you can wander in direction after direction.
It also might be, I mean, it's kind of interesting that to this day, people, every Halloween, tons and tons of people want to dress up like Frankenstein, or they call it Frankenstein. Well, it's not Frankenstein, it's really the monster. Yeah. But you think, why is that hold such appeal? And I guess because whenever you feel that you're different, if it's on Halloween, that's the one day where you're like, oh, if I'm different, I'll show you just how different I am, and I'm going to celebrate my difference, and I'm going to, you know, dress up in this costume. And it's kind of interesting how even like people who've never read the book, just that symbol is resonating with them.
Yeah. It, we could do a historical analysis, with the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Beauty and the Beast, but Frankenstein is the monster that really captures the cultural imagination over time. And is the book that great? And it is, but is that, or was it perhaps and it's the mad scientist along with it. Beauty and the Beast, Hunchback of Notre Dame don't have the mad scientist. Madeline, your hand's up.
I once again forgot what I was just about to say. It was about, so first of all, Frankenstein is easy to dress up as, just like being a vampire is easy to dress up as. So that is one piece of eternal appeal. The other thing is you can go around kind of making weird sounds and putting your arms out in front of you, or whatever we think Frankenstein does. I was thinking, for some reason, what you were saying cast me back to the conversation we'd had earlier about Frankenstein being God and the creature being his creation. It makes it kind of I don't know what you'd call it, maybe it's certainly kind of a theological statement on her part to be saying, God has created human beings and now rejects us, leaves us to our own devices, and we're left to kind of fight it out here and try to survive as best we can, when in fact, our creator could be helping us one hell of a lot more. If this is indeed the all-powerful creator. I also wonder if it's one of those things like Gnosticism or Manichaeanism, that the created world is kind of a bad shadow world of the ideal world, which in the world of the novel is that of civilized human beings. And then the created world would be analogous to I'll call him Adam Frankenstein.
Great, thank you. Looking at my notes here, I'm going to throw another question on the table. There's a line in the novel that we read, the duties of a creator towards his creature. I think the line was, in the context, Victor says, for the first time I realized the duties of a creator towards his creature, but I don't have the exact text in front of me. What are the duties of a creator towards his creature? What did Victor suddenly realize he owed to this creature when they meet? Mike.
I don't think he's with us anymore.
No, I think I'm still with you. Mary Shelley had her real job before she wrote the book was to help sell her hobbies, poetry and creations, and so she knew a lot of people in the publishing industry, because very few things were published by women during that period of time. Were authored by women in that period of time. One of the people that she obviously knew was Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin was the so-called modern Prometheus of that time. He invented the lightning rod. He started a journal called the Journal of Applied Physics, which still exists today, and except it's run by Springer Verlag in Germany. People who created that were Leiden, who invented the Leyden jar, and Lavoisier, and all of those people who were doing creative science. The best scientists of the time at that time came through Franklin, and not to mention that Franklin was pretty smart in his own right. So it would seem that a lot of the inspiration, and last time we talked about some of the people that might have inspired Frankenstein. Franklin was probably one of the names, and that was in that mode. So so that so that was, so Madeline said Frankenstein was a better name for Victor. Okay. That's better than anything that I was going to say. So I'll yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
Franklin.
So you started addressing Doug's question of what's the implication of the modern Prometheus and Franklin as a Prometheus. But then we have two questions on the table. What's the implication in the novel The Modern Prometheus? And my question was, what are the duties of a creator towards his creature?
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
According to the monster himself, he who has no name, his request before he started killing everybody, that he wanted the monster to create a bosom buddy for him, a mate.
We haven't gotten
anatomically correct. Yeah. Thank you.
No spoilers there, Mike. Anyone else with thoughts on either The Modern Prometheus or the duties of a creator towards his creature?
Well, I have something that's sort of related to it, but it's different. It's a question for later. I think it's worth asking later, why did Hollywood do what it did to this story? Which is to sort of, and I have some theories about it, but you know, because the monster is big and dumb, right? And the creature is brilliant and big and huge and powerful and mind and body. He's not aesthetically beautiful. Not by their standards, but maybe he is. But it's like, but the duty, I guess, well, now we're getting into the spoilers. I mean, the duty comes in, and I don't remember whether he's extorted or whether he decides it's a good idea, but it's later, so that's related to the spoilers. He clearly responds to the creature's appeal, which he's winding to in his story in the section we just read. He's sort of, you can tell the monster has a plan, that this story is meant to convince Frankenstein to do something for him. And the vehicle who teaches the creator that he needs to be responsible is the creature. And that's where I think it's also gets into the religious, biblical, Gnostical ideas that the Greeks had, that there's an absolute truth and beauty, but the world was designed by a mediocre designer and built by a worse craftsman. You know, it's like the designer wasn't very good, and the guy who got hired to build it was even less sort of refined. And that's sort of the Gnostic belief that this is really kind of, we're dominated by a demon god who doesn't know what he's doing. And Frankenstein is sort of that. He's sort of he creates, but then abdicates. I think Madeline said, you know, you create and then you run away and leave your creatures on their own.
But usually you give them 20 years of education, or at least 15, or 5 or something.
Oh, that's an important point that Allison hit on, that I was putting it as I was hearing her talk and my own ideas before, is that some parents create children as if they're an artistic project. And if you're not as beautiful and powerful as they expect, it's like, well, throw that into the wastebasket, and it's almost worse if it's done spiritually and intellectually than physically, literally. I mean, if you really abuse the child can find their own way. But if you manipulate them with this, your own perverse desire for them to be something they don't want to be. And I've known kids who've joined the Marines to escape, or artistic parents. I know 2 or 3 of them, actually. That's about the one thing you can do to really freak your artistic mother out. You don't really hate your mother, you'll join the Navy, but if you really want to scare her, you go into the Marines. No, it's so the curiosity of what have I created is the thing that he lacks too. He doesn't even hang around to go, what's this going to do on its own? That's like, which is probably where the real creative act is create something and then see how it's going to operate in the world.
Any other thoughts on the modern Prometheus or the duties of a creator towards their creature? Any other thoughts on interpretation? I've got The Art of Interpretation. Does this novel excite your interpretive faculty? Are you, more than any other novel, I mean, more than any other writing, is there anything about interpretation that anyone would like to share at the end? I've been following the model of what we consider and how we consider it as a model of interpretation. Is that helping, or do we just interpret and not need models?
Well, I think, my own thing, maybe the way I was raised by a lawyer and a guy who loved to teach the Jewish prophets in Mormon Sunday school. He was a very unique approach to life. But my first step is just, what does it say? What does it actually say? And can we determine what it actually says? And then, or how does it make me feel when I read it? You handshake a book, and then the next time you read it to go, well, what's really going on here? I thought it was this, but something else is going on. And so I think interpretation often comes as a very late stage, even though part of me wants to really leap to interpretations, but part of me says that's the thing you do later when you really master a script, when you really know what it says. Then you can interpret it, you can misinterpret it willfully and do a good job with it. But I think the movie is a really drastic misinterpretation of the book. So I think that in the end would be interesting to say, why did they interpret this story that way for the movies?
Madeline?
Yes, I think it is a fascinating question of why did they interpret the story that way, and how would it be interpreted in film, 200 years from now, when presumably the culture will be quite different. I think that I certainly wouldn't be looking at all these depths of meaning were I not in this group. I would have read it. I would certainly have seen some things in it. I would probably have made the comparison to bioengineering that's going on right now. but I wouldn't have, and certainly to Mary Shelley's life. I think that the writing style, it's very much a product of its time. If you wrote something in this style now and took it to a writing workshop, probably, half the words would be cut out. You would be told not, all your characters have to show their feelings, not tell them. You've got the pathetic fallacy going on where nature is mimicking everything and your moods and everything. I mean, it would really be taken apart and it would be entirely different. And so there's a value to the period style that really, it adds a lot of depth to it because the characters aren't really telling me as the reader how to feel, but they are certainly going on and on about how they feel. And it's a more psychological kind of writing, I think, than say Dostoevsky, than in Demons. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Anyone else? Final thoughts for today?
I will save them for later, but I think there are political issues of why the movie was done one way and why Mary Shelley created the monster in another way. What is the sleeping genius and what is maybe the trust of the working people or not? And is there a genius in the working people? Or are they just to be feared? And so the monster really is stupid. And he elicits stupid reactions from the stupid townspeople, right? But the creature in the novel is really brilliant, and nobody can seem to digest his presence or his ideas, because he's the one who really challenges Frankenstein ultimately in the end. Even now we're seeing it in this section we just read. He's laying out a story that has a didactic moral for the creator.
That I exist and learned French and you abandoned me.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think the fact that they changed him and made him dumber shows it's like reinforcing this idea that people don't accept things that are different. So here he is, he's this different character, and then to make it even worse, they have to take away his intelligence. It's like the movie industry actually demeaned him more than what Mary Shelley was having them do in the book.
Well,
it's like they did exactly what she was making fun of, only they took it another step further without even realize. It's ironic, they didn't even realize they were doing it, but they did it.
Well, so one argument might be the prejudice of our times.
Yeah, exactly.
And that they missed that Mary Shelley. They missed the interpretation that Mary Shelley has, that we should value the other.
Right.
You created a superhuman. I like Doug's model that to learn French in 2 years. I mean, it would take me 6 or 12.
Take me my whole life, and I'd still fail to do it.
This is a. Yeah, go ahead, Alice.
I just think it also comes when you think about that time in history. That's when Europe was really expanding and traveling. I mean, I know they'd started a few hundred years earlier, but they're really traveling into all these other parts of the world. And so as they encountered these other people frequently, and to this day, they want to say, oh, well, they're not as smart, they're not as this, they're not as that. And then as they get to know, they're like, wow, they're actually really, really smart. I think there's still this idea, prevalent. I mean, even when you look at like curriculums for schools, they study Europe and they study American history, and there's almost no history learned in K through 12 of any other cultures. They give it a little, and they act like, well, Europe created all the wonderful things. And then what's funny is then if you actually get on a plane and go to these other places, You know, you go to a museum in Tokyo and everything in the museum is 2,000 or 3,000 years old, you know, and you're like, oh, wow. So big whoop, Europe has some paintings that are 100 years old. Oh, put it in the museum. You know, I mean, sometimes when people think they really truly believe that Europe had all the smart people, like that actually shows their own ignorance, that they don't know anything about the history of the planet. There have been some brilliant people all over the planet throughout history. So the other is not bad. The other, you maybe just get to know the other to learn about it.
I think I maybe talked to CJ about this about 10 years ago, even that it became apparent to me because I was raised, and we had, the great books of the Western world, and they were there, and that's a project. And I think it's an important project, actually, because you read the books as opposed to the books about the books, and they're really well written, compared to all the derivative writers. It's easier to read Freud than people writing about Freud,
Right.
and so looking at those are good. But then there are other movements to sort of widen that. There's another book that sort of widens that to a global level, and at some point in my life, I realized a lot of Western university people just wanted to pretend it was all created there, so they wouldn't have to bother to relearn everything they know. They were just lazy. If we're not the center of all great literature, I'm still in kindergarten, and I think that a lot of academics just want to stay in kindergarten rather than look at the global reality.
Yeah.
Part of it is our prejudice that Mary Shelley in her radical, both editions of the book, I feel, are radical in acceptance of the sympathetic treatment of a monster who is vastly different, and there are other elements of the novel that also address these issues, as Doug, you were saying, political. In the first chapter we read for this time, you have Elizabeth reminding, he doesn't need reminding, but the conceit of the story is, I need to introduce Justine Moritz, so I'll pretend in my writing by Elizabeth to Victor that you might not remember Justine Moritz, so for the sake of the reader, I'll get to this is not the way modern writers would do it, I think.
Yeah, that was actually, I thought, was very clumsy. It was like saying, as you know, Captain, we are now standing on the bridge of the starship, traveling faster than the speed of light.
Exactly. But in that passage, there's this.
Is this Elizabeth saying this? What's the passage again? Say it. It's Elizabeth saying
in the letter from Elizabeth in chapter
early on, yeah.
5. It's chapter 5 in both, I think. There's the Republican institutions of Switzerland.
Oh, right.
And the great monarchies. A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France and England. Justine thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant in condition which in our fortunate country does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. So this issue that's going to come up with the creature is in this introduction to Justine Moritz at the beginning of our reading from this time.
No, that I did highlight that section, actually. That's an interesting section, which needs maybe more discussion. Our monarchy, that faith in democracy is interesting. That pops up in little places throughout it. And she must have gotten it from her father, who apparently, just looking up something briefly, was something of an anarchist, which is trusting people to do the right thing if they're free to do the right thing, And I think Bucky is kind of an anarchist when it comes to politics, He wouldn't call himself that, I don't think, but He'd use the word freedom, I think. But
So that when you take these, even when you're reading it the first time, some of these things will light up and register. And then a couple of chapters later, you might see the resemblance, the prejudice against the creature, the prejudice against servants in England and France, the issue of prejudice and in its multifarious manifestations. And Mary Shelley is very much playing with that in this novel, to my reading.
I have a question that might be worth picking up. We're sort of near the end, but Justine, I keep bouncing around in my head. Was she executed because she was lower class, even though she'd served devoutly these people? But that doesn't count when she's on trial. She's not one of us. But she, whether like the monster, there's a projection that this can only be bad. And she looked good, and she appeared to be good, but she wasn't really good. And is that because they're not trusting her because she comes from a lower class?
The way it occurred to my reading was when the circumstantial evidence appeared, everyone jumped on it, sort of like mob.
Right.
And, sort of like the same prejudice that Victor used when he blamed the creature,
right,
but applied to the community scale. And I think that's just a fascinating dynamic of jumping to conclusions, community and individual leaps of imagination that then we get it in our heads and we can't get it out of our heads. And sometimes we're right. The novel seems, even at this point, to imply that the creature is probably guilty. But at this point in the novel, it's a murder mystery. This is detective fiction. We don't know who actually killed William yet. We're going to find out next reading. Go
ahead. I'm sorry.
And so at this point in the novel, it's still a mystery. Should we believe the community, and did Justine do it? Or is Victor right? Or was it someone else who, God knows who that might be. But in a murder mystery, you don't know. And we as readers at this point in the novel don't know who murdered William. Or was it clear to you who murdered? Allison, you've never read it before. Was it clear to you who murdered William?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's not clear at this point. It will become clear in the next reading.
That's true. I think the first time through, I was less certain as what's the truth of this or that. And then this time I'm projecting my knowledge into it.
And for that reason, Victor's jumping to conclusions, the community and the justices jumping to circumstantial evidence and a conclusion. But we as the reader don't know who's right and who's wrong. But everyone's jumping to a different conclusion. They can't all be right.
Is that what you mean, Madeline, by jumping to a conclusion? I'm not
Oh,
I don't know that English phrase jumped
oh
out.
yeah. Well, it was that I've read it in older books at least that in England, if you have moved up a notch in the class structure, people who are still looking down on you will refer to you as a jumped up plumber,
Ah,
or Justine might be a jumped up peasant.
right.
Like how we would say nouveau riche.
I find myself in what you are all talking about, thinking about the Central Park Five and how everybody just assumed these five teenage black teenagers were guilty. Trump was one of the leaders of that hysteria. And Joan Didion, just by the nature of the hysteria, knew that the story was wrong. And one was one of the few voices that countered the total acceptance by the media, you know, being tried by the media. And Joan Didion, wow, I mean, she somehow knew the energy of what was going on and knew that that it was wrong. They were wrong.
I think it's one of the most radical parts of this book that Mary Shelley takes on this fundamental issue of injustice in our justice system. Madeline, your thoughts?
Yes, I thought I would just give a little bit of a little bit more about the Central Park Five. The climate of fear here in New York then was very, very intense. There was really a sense of things have gone completely off the rails. You can be attacked anywhere at any time. If you remember Bernard Getz,
Mhm.
the man who shot the teenagers on the subway because they approached him and they were trying to rob him or something, he'd had it. And I think a lot of people wouldn't have done the same thing, but could certainly understand where he was coming from. And so I think that the jumping, the decision that it was these five kids who were the Central Park Five. They were a very convenient symbol of black youth run amok in the city. Where in fact that was hardly the only problem in New York at the time, but it was a symbol of what was happening. And in that sense, it reminds me of the film version of Frankenstein. I actually was thinking it would be very interesting if once we're done with the two books, if we all watched it and then got together to discuss the film, because it looks as if it came
Yeah.
out in the mid to late 1930s. So the First World War would have been over. We would be in the run-up to the Second World War and in the Great Depression.
Well,
That's interesting when it came out.
My plan was I've got some videos from YouTube to supplement our interpretive edges for the last two sessions.
That's great. That's really great. Thank you, CJ.
So I haven't updated the event descriptions yet with that material, and I probably won't. The next thing I need to do for the event descriptions is I need to come up with my list of 12 to 14 themes for the ending portion. I've already posted for the reading in 2 weeks, the third section, which I'm calling The Monster's Requisition. The themes are in the event description. I added a video clip from the first session so that I don't have to repeat myself of some items. And I need to add that link to the next two events. And since we're not talking until November, December for the last two meetings, putting off writing up and finalizing my plans on the last two events. Does anyone have a final word, or should we sign off soon? Anyone with a final thought? No? Nothing on your mind?
Actually, my one thought that I had was I was living in New York at the time of the with the Central Park jogger, and I remember you know, my parents are like, "Don't go in the park, don't go in the park," and I remember it felt like hysteria, and I remember at the time thinking that I felt that they had been I felt like there wasn't enough proof. You know, I felt it right then. I felt like they just, you know, it was a racial thing. And so many people said, no, 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 it's proof, but it felt wrong at that time. You know, it just did. And I was, you know, a young girl in New York at that time, thinking this just doesn't sit right. It just didn't sit right. And I didn't have anything to go on. I didn't know any of the, you know, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't examine any of these things. But it just in my heart did not sit right. It felt like it was more racially motivated than, you know, they wanted someone to demonize. And you know, what a shame that they, you know, these years later. But I don't know. That's why I feel like it's so important, you know, don't demonize people that are different, whether it's with a, you know, whether it's a crime or it's not a crime, you know. Take your time, you know, it's more important to get all the facts right than it is to just throw somebody in jail so you feel like you won, you know.
Or in the novel's case, execute them.
Yeah, like, okay, must have been this one. They're done. Well, why don't you like slow down a little bit and examine all the evidence first? I mean, it's a pretty big deal, you know. Yeah.
You know, it occurred to me while you were speaking that the circumstantial evidence that Justine did it or that the creature did it is about the same. Justine, you know, isn't actually in the location of the murder that the night of the murder when the murder happens, but she's there the next day and they don't discover the body until the next day. So without modern forensics, you can't prove that she wasn't there. I mean, modern forensics, we'd have the DNA analysis, Justine wasn't there. Victor sees the creature. He goes to Plain Palais, the place that I'm not sure about this suddenly, but I believe that when Victor sees the monster, he is near the scene of the murder. So he has the creature placed at the scene of the murder 2 months after the murder. That's really sketchy circumstantial evidence. I mean, the evidence against Justine is actually much stronger because they don't have the forensics to know that she wasn't near the murder scene until long after the murder. Anyway, anyone with a anyone want to add anything?
Well, I have an odd hit, and I'll say it very briefly. 1989 is when the Central Park thing was happening. It was also the savings and loan scandal, and I'd been subscribing to a lot of business magazines through the 80s. And then the savings and loan scandal, that was the top story. And then suddenly every business magazine in the country had in red and black letters race as the big issue in America. And it wasn't at that particular point in time, but within 3 or 4 years, it became the big issue. of the time. And so instead of really tracking what happened during the savings and loan scandal, it was like race. Oh, that's the problem. We're being destroyed by young black teenagers. Whereas the white men who pillage and loot the savings and loan thing, those guys really know how to do some damage. But it was like the story wasn't that. The story was teenagers, black teenagers. And then Willie Horton, Willie Horton was actually before when Bush was running against. So that was the first thing. Willie Horton, that guy helped get Bush get elected. So suddenly, and then by the time the LA blew up, race was an issue, or supposedly an issue, when really the issues are bigger than that. But I was surprised. It was shocking. Within 1 or 2 weeks, every business magazine's cover story was about race, and they hadn't finished reporting the savings and loan scandal. But that was the burning issue of the day from the business magazines.
So the business magazines wanted to change the subject.
Right.
And they get their stories from the people that buy their advertising. And well, okay.
It's also when Godfather 3 was written, which says once you've made all the money you can in Las Vegas, you have to go to Wall Street to make more money. And there was actually a research, but that's a whole different sort of avenue. But it's interesting that all of this happened in that period.
Those are incredibly interesting points, Doug. I think a lot of what we see now is transgender positivity and body positivity, especially for women.
Mm-hmm.
So what's all that distracting from?
Yeah, the main stories are always distracting from something. And they actually say there were studies of the gold rush in California that when there was a mother lode discovered and there was a lot of gold to be mined, the racist incidents went down. And when the gold fields dried up, that's when they wanted to exclude the Mexicans and the Chinese and everybody else and the Italians. And so suddenly and then there'd be a discovery of another mother lode somewhere else in California, and all the racism would disappear because there was enough to go around, or the illusion that there was enough to go around. So I think it's usually often hiring economic manipulations, or I don't know. Yeah.
And an anthropological way to think of it might be, when we study some First Nations, there's some of these cultures have very elaborate protocols to make sure that nobody ever gets too wealthy. The chief is obliged, because they're so good at accumulating wealth, to give it all away. And when these cultures are defeated by conquest and all, they're replaced with a mafiosa mindset that doesn't have the boundary of limits. And maybe Frankenstein, the novel, this idea that there are limits to creating life and what we can and should do, and that these prejudices need to be resisted.
Interesting.
In my reading. Mike, you want us to add something?
Well, what was just brought up is a really important thing. Now it's what came first, the chicken or the egg type thing. Also, there is a concept of feedback loop. Did they create a deception of a gold rush to take the mind off of something, or when one person discovered gold, everybody else flocked to that, even though the only people who made money were the people who sold shovels rather than the people who went out to find gold, with a few exceptions. So we see these trends of being self-limiting and growing up to a point because of positive and negative feedback loops that go on to the system dynamics of the economy. And there are models of this kind of thing happening that, and depending on how you tweak those models, you could become a believer of conspiracy theories, or you could become a believer in that these are natural processes that are triggered by some sort of impulse function, of which the person who created the impulse function had no idea what he was doing. He was just doing his own evolutionary survival action. So, at least at present, we don't know. There is a guy named Stephen Wolfram, who was a disciple of all people, Richard Feynman, who wrote a book called, of all titles, The Theory of Everything, in which he tried to explain economics in terms of this thing, and enveloped both Keynes, Galbraith, and Ayn Rand in one 4,000-page book.
Oh, okay. I think we've exhausted this section of Frankenstein for the moment. Next time in 2 weeks, which September 4th. Oh boy, that's Labor Day weekend, isn't it? We're those people who are reading the 3-volume edition. It's volume 2, chapters 5 through 9, and volume 3, chapters 1 and 2. And those of us who
Say
are
that
reading
again, 5 through 9? Volume 2, 5 through 9?
5 through 9 in volume 2, and chapters 1 and 2 in volume 3. If you're reading the 1824 2-volume edition, it's volume 2, chapters 1 through 7. Wait a second.
Yeah, I may not be free on Labor Day. Turns out there's a barbecue. Well, no, I could maybe go later.
You know what? I gotta check that. Oh boy. Oh, yes, it's in every, where are we? September 4. Yes, I'm right.
Labor Day
Chapters
weekend,
1 through
yeah.
7. So it's the 3-volume edition, volume 2, 5 through 9, and volume 3, chapters 1 and 2. And in the 2-volume edition, it's volume 2, chapters 1 through 7. So I'll see you on September 4th if you can make it. If not, we will be finishing the 1818 or 1824, which are, verbatim as I understand it, other than the division into chapters, on September 18th. And then in November, we will start all over from the beginning with the 1831 edition. So, unless there's a final question or comment, I think I've never ended a Zoom session. Allison, I assume I just hit the big red end button.
Thank you, CJ.
Thank you,
Thank
CJ.
you, Madeline.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Yeah, just hit the leave button and it'll should end it all.
Okay. Hopefully everything will work. Bye now and see you next time.
Bye-bye.